So a couple months ago, I was with Lauren, and we were at a baby shower. And as far as showers go, you have a rain shower, and then a baby shower is just slightly above that, as far as a good time. It wasn't Lauren's shower; it was one of her friends. But this shower actually did happen to be a good time. True story. We had fun. It was a beautiful day. For this spring, beautiful day outside, which is rare, and they had a barbecue outside, a lot of good food, and so it was just fun to be around friends and get to know some of Lauren's coworkers as well. But while we were there, I was talking to the father-to-be. It was his first child, and asked him, I've gotten to know him a little bit, and asked him about how are you feeling about being a new dad? And obviously he was excited, but he was also nervous. He was nervous about, just the responsibility that was going to be for him. And so one of the things he had been working on was on getting life insurance. And he wanted to make sure that his family was covered. And yet getting life insurance had been some trouble for him. He mentioned to me that, as he was filling out the questionnaire, he had some hesitancy as he was filling it out. There was a number of questions like, what do you make? How old are you? What are your exercise habits? And, they ask you different questions of is this something you do once a year, once a month, once a week? And so sometimes you kind of feel this temptation to fib a little bit. But on one of the questions, it was, how often do you smoke? And he wasn't a guy who smokes on a daily basis. He didn't smoke on a weekly basis, even a monthly. And they had each of those options. But right below or right above no smoking was, do you smoke on a yearly basis? And he said he felt tempted to, just be like, I smoke, a few times a year. So he felt tempted just to say none of the above. But, he wanted to be a man of integrity. He's, a follower of Christ. And so he put the yearly. After he got the results back for what they would quote him at, the price that he got back, because he had said he smoked on occasion, the price was out of his range. It was a price that was no longer feasible to have life insurance. And my question is, have you ever had that kind of a situation where you struggled to do the right thing, and you went away ahead and you did it, you had integrity, but after doing it, things didn't work out well for you? You expected because you did the right thing, you tried to have integrity, and you thought things were going to work out well, but it actually was the opposite. It backfired, and things didn't turn out so well. Maybe for you, it was something that happened at work or at school, and you saw something that you felt like was not above board. You saw something that made you uncomfortable or that seemed unethical. And so you went ahead and you reported it to the powers that be, the proper people over top of you. And yet, when you report it, you expected to be congratulated for your integrity and your courage, and yet it was unsettling because it was actually just the opposite. People were not excited to hear you report on others. People actually were frustrated with you, and you received a negative consequence. Whether that was, a true consequence, or whether that was even more of a social isolation, an ostracization at your job. Or maybe you've worked on a group project with someone, again, at school or work or anything. Maybe it's even outside of both of those on a more of a family level. And you felt like someone in that group really didn't carry their weight. Has anyone been in a group project and felt like that happened to them? Maybe that person, like you were willing in front of everyone else to give them credit for their work or lack thereof. But then when it came time for them to share about everyone else's participation, they actually didn't give you credit. They kind of took way more than they deserved. And again, you had that thought of why am I doing this? Why am I going to continue to serve others if they don't serve me? Why am I going to put my neck out for others if they don't put their neck out for me? The last example is even a friendship. I think one thing that Scripture says is that a good friend tells you the hard truth. And so maybe you saw a pattern in a friend's life. And this pattern that you thought was negatively affecting them was not helping them to develop into the person that they wanted to be. And so you had the courage and you spoke into that relationship and you shared that hard truth with them. And yet rather than receiving it with graciousness, rather than receiving it with appreciation, they lashed out on you. And again, you had to ask yourself that question, why am I going to continue to put my neck out for others if it backfires on me? Why am I continue to do good if it doesn't turn out well for me? Well, that's the exact question that Peter is wrestling with in our text tonight. He was really wrestling with that question of why continue to do good for others if it backfires on us? Like, why continue to do the right ethical thing of integrity when it doesn't work out so well? So I'm going to kind of dive right into our text, and then we'll kind of move on from there. So if you want to put it back up on the screen, starting in verse 8. So verse 8 reads, "Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, and a tender heart and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." So in this first section, Peter is reminding us of what Luke and I have been preaching on the last 3 weeks. Peter's been talking about that no matter where you find yourself in life, that we don't always get to choose our circumstances. But the thing that we do get to choose is how we respond to it. And so over the last 3 weeks, we've been looking at a number of different situations that we might find ourselves in where we don't necessarily have the power to choose our circumstances. But Peter's been telling us that we do always have the choice to choose how we respond to those situations. He's been telling us that we can respond in ways that are self-serving, in ways that are selfish, or we can respond in ways that are holy, in ways that honor God, and in ways that honor the other. But if you do that, I think we can all agree that's like a noble thing to do, to respond well when you're not receiving love, to respond well when you're not being treated fairly. But I think for all of us, like if we start to do that, we're all going to have the same nagging question that comes in the back of our head. Why am I going to continue to do this if it's not paying off? Like, it's one thing to like decide for the first time that, like, yes, I'm going to put my neck out for someone else, even when it doesn't pay off for me. But what about like when it doesn't happen the second time? All of us are going to begin to wonder, like, should I continue to do good for others, even though I'm kind of getting burned, even though there's getting pushback, even though I'm not receiving anything that's helping me get forward in life? Should I continue to hold that conviction, or should I just do what someone chooses, just to be passive? And so that's what Peter starts to address now in verses 13 through 17. So if you want to put those up here. "Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do this with gentleness and respect." I think there's one more. Oh, yeah, there's one more. You got to go. It was kind of weird. There you go. "For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil." And there's a lot of challenging, you can keep that up there, challenging words in that text, but I think this is the most provocative of all of them. "For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil." It's better for suffer for doing good than doing evil. And I think this is the provocative statement because it's really challenging for us to wrestle with us. I think we all get suffering for doing evil. Like, let's say you go and rob a bank today and you end up in jail. You can't wrestle with God and say, like, why, God? Like, why am I here? It's obvious. Like you are there because you made a mistake and now you're paying the consequences. Or if you lie on your resume about, some additional work experience that you don't have, or an additional degree, and if it ends up you get caught and found out and you get fired from your job, again, you can't wonder, like, have this existential crisis of, like, what is happening to me? No. I mean, it's obvious. Like, when you do wrong, like, we can expect sometimes to suffer the consequences. But when you suffer for doing what's right, I mean, if we're honest, like that can be kind of challenging for us to work through in our head. Like, it makes sense to suffer for doing wrong, but like when you've done the right thing in life, like you expect to be rewarded, or you expect at least to have it be nominal. But like if you do the right thing and you are punished for it, if you suffer for it, like what gives? Like why would we continue to be doing well? Like why would we be continuing to be people who are acting in integrity? And so today I just want to give us 3 reasons here for why we should continue doing good even if we're suffering as a result. Why we should continue to do good even if we're suffering. So the first answer is just to have a clear conscience. That's the first reason. I mean, there's a number that Peter gives us, but let me just share 3 with you. And the first is that you can have a clear conscience. So about 2 weeks ago, I was at the gym, and my gym, for the parking lot, there are 2 rows of cars. So 2 rows of cars, and it's kind of up on a hill as you go up it. So the row that is flush to the gym is here, then the row that's behind it is just above it. And so my car was parked in that first row, and I'm backing up my car. And as I'm backing up, I could have sworn there was nothing behind me. I thought I was backing up into an empty space. But as I hit that accelerator, thankfully not too hard, I hear a crunch. And I have that thought that goes through my mind of, oh no, like what is the damage here? And so right away I flip the car then back into forward and I drive and just looking out my rearview window to see what had happened. And so as I look at the car, I see, thank goodness, there's no structural damage. It wasn't like a dent or something. But as I look back, I kind of don't even want to look too carefully since I don't actually see any real damage. And I'm like, all right, there's nothing real here, so I'm just going to go. And so I start driving my car out of the parking lot, and I get about halfway down the next block, and I start thinking, I probably should turn around. I probably should really check to make sure there isn't actually any damage before I, go on my way. And so I park my car there, and I start walking back to check out this car that I hit, just to make sure there was actually nothing wrong with it. And so when I walk up to that car, I crouch down and I take a look at it to see like what had actually happened, and there's a number of scratches on it. I definitely had scratched up the car fairly good, but I thought, again, there's no structural damage, so it's probably fine. I'm just going to walk away. And so I walked back to my car, and I just sat there in my car for a few minutes. And I'm like, all right, man, you want to be a man of integrity, and obviously at the same time, you don't want to have your insurance rates go up. You don't want to have to deal with your wife being mad at you if you got into a car accident, and yet you still want to be a man of integrity. And so I got my notebook out, I had a sheet of paper, and I wrote a little note on it of saying, hey, this is my number, this is my information, this is my insurance information. And I brought it back to that car, and I put it on the windshield. And then, thankfully, they didn't call back. Because I figured it should be better for them to decide in that situation whether or not they thought the damage was enough that they wanted it taken care of, rather than me deciding advantageously for them. But the reason why I was so glad that I did that, it wasn't that I got, to escape not having to pay or have my insurance go up. But the reason why I was so glad is because I had a clear conscience afterwards. And I tell you that story even all the while knowing that there's so many stories where I haven't, in the end, done the right thing, even after wrestling with it. But when we act in integrity, we have that opportunity there to have a clear conscience. And how much better would it have been for me to have my insurance rate go up because I did the right thing than to have my insurance go up because I did a hit and run. And so when we have integrity, we still, at times can suffer, but we get to have a clear conscience because we're suffering even though we've done something righteous. And so it's interesting in the text how it talks about that. The other benefit, right there, this isn't a separate one, but it's kind of like a part B. The other benefit is that you don't have to fear anyone when you're doing something for righteousness' sake. Sure, there might be a scary consequence, or sure, someone might be angry at us, but if we're truly doing something for the sake of righteousness, what that means is we're fearing God more than that person. We're fearing God more than that system. And when we do that, even though we might have fear, even though we might feel anxiety in our stomach, we also get to have this peace, get to have this freedom, knowing that we actually are fearing the one we ought to fear and putting our trust in him before others. So again, the first reason is that you can have a clear conscience. That's why it's a good reason to suffer for doing good. But the second reason is that people will notice. So if you've ever been to our apartment, which many of you have, some of you have not. If you have not, I'd love to have you over sometime. One of the things you'll notice is that we have a very large bookshelf. And as a pastor and a librarian, it's just going to happen. You're going to have a large bookshelf right in the middle of the apartment. And one of the things I enjoy doing, since my wife is a librarian, is I enjoy every once in a while when I'm bored, just kind of perusing her titles. Because they're much more interesting than the books I have oftentimes. They're these really cultured Pulitzer Prize winner titles, and I'm really curious just to see what is in them. So one day I'm just bored again and decide to look through the titles, and I look through one of my wife's titles, and it's called The Metaphysical Club. No clue what it's about. But I start reading it, and it ends up being, just to give you a little background on the book, it's a Pulitzer Prize-winning book for history. And the book is all about the intellectual history of America and how really the idea of pragmatism, which is just doing what makes sense, doing what works, more or less, how that has shaped America. And so as I'm reading it, one of the things that he says early on that I thought made a lot of sense is he says that people never do things unless it's within their self-interest. People always do things that are within their self-interest. So someone might go to the gym, and that's not fun to work out, but you're still doing it for the health benefits. Or even in, let's say, a more Eastern communal society where, it's more about the community than the actual individual. You're still caring more about the community. You're still sacrificing for the community, because if you don't, people are going to look down on you negatively, and so you're still kind of self-benefiting yourself by even putting the community above yourself. And here in the West, it's obvious, it's part of our fabric of America to still put yourself first and to do everything that within your self-interest. And they're saying this was a positive overall. But I'm not here to debate whether it's positive or negative, but what I want to say about this is when you don't put yourself first, people notice. If this is the MO, our modus apparatus for every single human individual is to do what works within your self-interest, then when you don't put yourself first, people will notice. They will wondering, what is it about your set of assumptions? What is it about the way you operate? What is it about your hope that lets you look beyond your present circumstances? And that's what Peter is sharing with us here in verse 15 and 16 when he says, "But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason of the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame." One way this passage has been often used is to really talk about this idea of apologetics, of defending the Christian faith. What I think is so fascinating, at least where we find ourselves right now, is that people today don't really care too much about how much you know until they know about how much you care. People care much more about how your worldview, your belief, what's the difference that it makes tangibly in your life before they care about whether or not it's true or what even it is. I think that's for all of us. We care much more about does something work? Does it make a difference? Before we actually even want to know what does it mean? What is it about? Is it true? And what I think is so fascinating about this text is that what Peter's saying here is that this isn't a new thing. And we often think that it's all about truth, and if we can prove truth to someone that's the end all be all. But what Peter is saying here is that no, this is actually how humans have always been. What is so much more important than actually why you believe something is how it works out. And so when you show that your faith actually causes you to act in different ways than what would be normal for everyone, people take notice. So when someone, let's say, takes credit for your ideas at work, and rather than lashing out on them, rather than being passive-aggressive to them, rather than Xing them out of your work life, when you have grace to them, maybe it'll be a difficult conversation one-on-one, but when you show them grace and continue to show them love, continue to show them kindness, you're showing the difference that Christ makes in your life. Or let's say you work at a restaurant or someplace where they do tips. And if all of your coworkers are only claiming a fraction of the tips, and yet you claim it all. And so that means when you claim it all, that you actually don't have as much disposable income as them, and so you can't necessarily keep up with them and doing all the things that they do. When you are willing to show that like your integrity is more important than having extra cash, like you are tangibly showing the difference that Christ makes in your life. Or when you speak up for other people, like that that means that the heat is going to get turned up on you. When you know that the wrath that is on another is going to be turned to you because you're having the courage to speak up for them, but you continue to do it nonetheless, you are showing and demonstrating the difference that Christ makes in your life. So again, the first reason to be willing to suffer for doing good is that like you get to clear conscience. But the second is that when you do so, you are showing that Christ makes a difference in your life, and people will notice that. The final reason is that when you continue to suffer for doing good, like you are emulating the life of Jesus. And the text tells us that in verse 18, where it says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit." So what this text right here is saying is that Jesus suffered for us. And so if we need a motivation right off the back for being willing to suffer for others, I mean, that's our motivation right there, is that he was willing to suffer for us for our sake. And if he suffered for us for our sake so that we might know God, like how much more, like what more motivation do we really need than to suffer for others for their sake, knowing one has already suffered for us? But this text gives us even more of a reason here. Starting in verse 19, it says, "In which he went down and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, and while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this now, saves you, not as a removal of the dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers have been subjected to him." So that text is a mouthful, and there are so many different interpretations on it. But the fascinating thing is that even though there's a number of different interpretations on whatever that means, the fascinating thing is that all the interpretations have one central key component in common. All commentators agree that the main point here, even though people might be kind of confused on like what are the side points, but the main point is that Jesus is vindicated. So the very beginning of that text, it mentions how Jesus was willing to suffer for the sake of unrighteousness. But then at the end, it talks about that after he's raised from the dead, that he stands before God at his right hand, and that all of the things that oppressed him are now subjugated to his feet. And so what that's telling you is that Jesus was vindicated for choosing to suffer for the sake of righteousness. And if Jesus was vindicated, if he was made right before God, then we can have that same hope as well. That God sees everything that we do. You know, when we are willing to suffer for the sake of righteousness, like he sees our actions. It's not going unnoticed. And what this text is telling us is that the same hope that Jesus had, that one day he would be vindicated before his Father would make all things right, like we get that same hope. And I think there's nothing more powerful than that for sustaining us if we really go through a difficult trial in our life when we're acting in integrity, but there's this really negative effect to us. To know that like it's not going unnoticed, that God sees it, and one day he will vindicate us for it. He will tell us that it has honored him. In Village Church, like there's so many people's approval we can seek after in this world. And it's not all wrong to do that by any means, but there's no approval that can ever be better than on the day that you stand before God to hear him say, "Faithful servant, well done." And so my question for you is like, whose recognition are you seeking after, Village Church? Are you seeking after that of your friends and family, which is fine in many ways, but like, are we ultimately seeking after the one who, when we will all stand before him, will say, "Faithful servant, well done"? Like, what words could be sweeter to our ears? So I gave you there 3 reasons for why we should respond well to suffering, why we should continue to suffer even if it's for, a good reason. And yet when those moments come, we're more than just logical creatures. We are so full of emotion, and that is good, but that's kind of how we're also created. And so how do we actually, in that moment when so many things are going through our mind, when we don't actually want to do it, how do we step into that? How do we continue to do good, even when we're suffering for it, even when we feel like we should have learned our lesson, we should have stopped doing it because it wasn't working out well for us? How do we continue to suffer for righteousness' sake when our human emotions are involved? And what I want to end here with today is that if we have any chance at doing this, we're going to have to train our minds. So think of everything we do in our lives is essentially just training our subconscious. And so if we are around people, and ourselves included, who do all things for what works out best for us, as that metaphysical club book said, and which I think we can all agree is our natural way of operating, if that's how all humans operate around us and we ourselves do the same, then if we're ever going to work outside of that, we're going to have to be intentional about it, because all those actions that we're already doing that are self-serving are training us to be people who still continue to act in self-serving ways. And so one way we can do that is obviously by reading our Bibles, by praying, but let me also give you one other avenue for training your mind, is to seek to serve others first, to seek to serve others even when you're getting a negative response for it. And the practice I want to give you here is called the daily examine. And so this was, created by a guy, his name was Ignatius of Loyola. And if you've ever heard of the Jesuits, he was the founder of the Jesuits. And so he wrote this book called Spiritual Exercises, where kind of like the idea of going to the gym and working out to get stronger. He's saying that if you want to get stronger in your spirituality, you also have to put effort into it. And yes, we as Christians totally believe, or if you identify as a follower of Christ, in general we believe that God is the one who does the work, but also, he wants us to obey. He also wants to be a part of that cultivating our minds, of the renewal of our minds. And so the daily examine is one exercise I just want to give to you that I think can be really helpful for cultivating a mind that's willing to endure suffering, even when it's for the sake of good. So if you're willing to, you don't have to close your eyes right now and pray here, but if you're willing, if you want, feel free to close your eyes and pray. And I'm just going to lead you through this exercise. If you feel more comfortable keeping your eyes open, 100% feel comfortable doing that as well, whatever you prefer. And I also posted this on our Facebook page. If you want to go back to it and find it to do it again in your own time, it's there. But we'll start with it right now. So here's the first of the 5 points. It says, place yourself in God's presence. And how it recommends doing that is give thanks for give thanks for God's great love for you. So just take a moment to do that. Give thanks for God's great love for you. I think of one or two things in your life that you can be thankful for, or ways that God has demonstrated his love for you. Second, pray for the grace to understand how God is acting in your life. And we believe that God is actively working in each of our lives, wherever we are on our spiritual journeys, that the Holy Spirit is doing something in our lives, and he wants us to draw us closer to the person of Christ. That's where he wants to draw all of us. And so what is God doing in your life? Pray for the grace to understand what God is up to. Third step is really where we're the meat and the bones of this exercise. So it says to review your day. Feel free to review your week. Recall specific moments in your feelings at that time. And so since we're thinking of suffering for the sake of righteousness, think of a time, whether that was today or this week, when you acted in a self-serving way, when you put yourself before another. Possibly it was after you did the right thing and you weren't rewarded for it. Possibly it was after you did the right thing and you were treated poorly. Or possibly it was just after someone treated you in their own way that was self-serving. But find one time that you acted in a self-serving way. Recall that moment. What were you feeling at that time? What was going through your mind? Step 4. Reflect on what you did, said, and thought in those instances Were you drawing closer to God or further away? So as you're taking this time here, think about how you were moving away in that moment. Since we asked you to think of a negative example, reflect on how Christ gives us the power to break this, how he lived in a selfless way. And when we follow him, the one who suffered for us for righteousness' sake, we can also suffer for him. So reflect on what you were actually doing of drawing closer to him or further away in that moment, and how Christ's model might help you to move further to him. And so step 5 is looking forward to tomorrow, looking at how you're going to act differently in light of this. So think of how you might collaborate more effectively with God's plan. Be specific, and we're going to conclude then with a prayer in a minute. But take a moment here, we're going to actually give you a minute here to make this your prayer to God, of how in light of how you want to be moving towards God in that selfish manner, of how you're going to plan to collaborate with God and his plan for your life. And we're going to end with the Lord's Prayer here, which will be up on the screen behind me. Our Father, who is in heaven, holy is your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who have sinned against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.